So let's jump in. This is our second installment in our webinar series on extended producer responsibility in Australia. And today we're going to be talking a bit about what brands can learn from global EPR schemes and how recovery and reuse outcomes have a part to play in that. So as we get more clarity around what this framework is going to look like in Australia, the question for brand owners, for retailers and manufacturers is starting to shift to how are these packaging decisions going to affect recovery outcomes, reporting obligations, and compliance risk. So the session's going to cover why effective packaging reform depends on having better collection, sorting, and recycling systems, what Australia can learn from international deposit return and recovery models, and how reuse can fit into Australia's emerging EPR framework. Starting this session, we're going to have our CEO, Elliot Costello, who's going to give a short update on the state of Australian packaging reform right now. And then he's going to introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Chris Gingell from TOMRA. Thanks, Chris, for joining us today. TOMRA is a global innovator of the reverse vending machine, and they continue to be leaders in sorting and recycling technology. Got experience across more than 40 deposit return markets. So Chris is going to bring his knowledge about the role that recovery and reuse infrastructure will play in EPR in Australia and what we can learn from international markets. So Chris and Elliot are going to go into a bit of a question and answer, and then Ed is going to, our COO, is going to talk through what EPR means in practical terms for brands. So drawing on what we can learn from mature EPR markets. And then we're going to finish with an audience Q&A. So if any questions come up for you during the next hour, please just add them into the chat during the session, and we'll do our best to answer them all at the end. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand it over to you now, Elliot.
Better come off mute. Thank you so much, Francesca. I want to start by thanking Chris. I've had a number of phone calls with Chris, and every time we talk, which is always about EPR, we end by saying we should catch up in person. So it's another online meeting today, Chris, but I'm very grateful for your time. When talking about the sort of necessity and the transition towards an EPR scheme, I don't think there's many more well qualified like you, Chris. Your background in public service, in policy in Australia and Victoria specifically, racing into the private sector at TOMRA, you're perfectly placed to help us with this conversation today. So super excited about it. I'm just going to dive into a quick presentation on where we are today. The sort of, I won't say state of the nation. It's a hard claim title to hang on to. But for those that joined for part one, I did a bit of a history, 1999 to 2026, about EPR. So where we were from the formation of the National Packaging Covenant through to today. I won't do that again. That webinar is available for circulation. You can contact Matt and our team or reply to any of our emails. It should be on our website too. But I'm going to sort of really focus on where we are in 2026 because that's what matters in terms of how close we're getting to national packaging reform. There's part of the politics will come out in my conversation with Chris. As you can imagine, politics is not an easy betting game. Every day there's a new piece of item that sits high on the agenda. So we're not going to give you much detail about dates and formations, but we will talk about the likely transition towards national packaging reform. So I'll start with what happened at the Environmental Ministers meeting at the end of March. This was a significant sort of turning point where our Federal Environment Minister, Murray Watt, effectively charged the states, so the state environment ministers, to go and come back with an intergovernmental agreement at the next M. And this is really the first sort of call for a national consistent packaging stewardship program, which is quite exciting. Obviously, in 2022, Tanya Plibersek, the former Federal Environment Minister, made a lot of noise about packaging reform. Murray, the new National Environment Minister, is sort of picking up the agenda now. And this sort of looks like a step in the right direction, and it gives a lot of confidence to industry that it's being taken seriously at a federal level. Hopefully, this will be the binding agreement we've been waiting for. So that happened in end of March. Feels like a long time ago now for many. I saw Boomerang Alliance and Australian Marine Conservation Society. A lot of us who have been working on EPR for the last sort of 6 to 12 months, but that did feel like a point in time where we got a bit of momentum. More recently, just last month, about exactly a month ago, Peter Whish-Wilson, the outgoing Green senator from Tasmania, introduced a private members bill, which led to a Senate inquiry at the end of June. And this is a pretty significant move by Peter. Plastic waste and packaging is a very big focus for Peter. And the Senate inquiry led to about 15 or 16, I think there's about 35, 40 submissions that were tabled, and 15 or 16 groups that were asked to present at the Senate inquiry. We were one of the groups, and it was an amazing day to sort of sit through and listen to all of the different presentations. What I saw was a lot less debate about whether it's necessary, but a lot more alignment about the implementation, the design, the timing, and how fast it's going to come. So that inquiry has now been tabled. It's part of Hansard. What that does in terms of politics, and Chris and I will have a chat about this more, is obviously Peter Whish-Wilson is part of a minority party, being the Greens party. He's an upper house senator, but it forces Labor to look at this issue. So federal Labor will now need to look at this issue and decide to reject the private members bill, and in doing so introduce their own piece of legislation or an amendment to an existing piece of legislation. So the probability is it won't pass this private members bill, but it kind of forces Labor to step up and say, well, thanks for your plan, we've got a better plan, and this is our proposal. So that was the end of June. I'm quickly going to just touch on what's happening globally too, because 2/3 of our Australia's trading partners, so 62 of our major trading partners have EPRs in place, and what happens around the world does matter. So as of today, we're 3 weeks out from EU's PPWR coming into play. So that's the packaging rule book. It's really, so it's a packaging and packaging waste regulation, and this is a major piece of legislation that will impact Australian brands that are placing products in the European market. Effectively, PPWR will change the direction of travel for regulations globally. I don't think it's a contentious thing at all to say that the EU takes a lot of leadership on sustainability initiatives and regulations. Very succinctly, because it is relevant for some of our customers who are here today and others that are joining, it really forms around the fact that on the 12th of August, everything changes. So there are limits and bans on certain types of materials being placed on market, specifically around PFAS that has any contact with food packaging. So that's quite a significant one that will change. That creates a changing relationship between brand owners placing materials on market and suppliers. There's a race for information. What that information is will come down to what's called a DOC, which is the Declaration of Conformity. And this conformity is like a packaging spec. And now that's required to be held and registered across different markets across the EU. If you want to put it quite simply, PPWR is like a consolidation of all the different EPR frameworks across the EU. Importantly, UK doesn't fall under PPWR as it's not part of the EU anymore, but most UK brands do sell into EU. The biggest piece for PPWR is evidence. You need to have evidence to really be able to audit what you're placing on market, and that comes down to capturing, structuring, and validating your packaging data. So that's today. Well, that's 3 weeks away from today, but PPWR is a moving target. This is step one of what will be more and more guidance and compliance in the European market. And why that matters for Australian brands is you might be selling already to Europe, so you need to know very quickly about what is in your packaging and be ready to comply by the 12th of August. Or for Australian brands selling in this market or more regional markets, knowing what Europe does matters, because over time Australia will go in the same direction. The last thing I just want to touch on briefly is something that's happening this week, and that's the Labor National Conference. Earlier this week, I joined WWF for a call to the Labor's Lean group. That's their environmental sort of advocacy network. Chris can probably give a bit more insight and life to what Lean's position is within the Federal Labor Party, but a very active group that cares about environmental sustainability issues. And we had a great discussion with them about how they're placing packaging reform on the national agenda for the Labor conference that's happening today and tomorrow in Adelaide. So that's part of the politics that's still live. I'll just conclude by mentioning that 2 webinars for an hour long each, probably not enough to really understand the moving parts of EPR schemes within Australia, within our near neighbours across Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and certainly the EU. So Matt and our team has been charged to prepare a regulation readiness course, and early, probably next month, we're going to release the first details about this course. We have sort of fallen into this world of EPRs and become semi-experts, and Ed's going to speak more broadly on what it means around capturing and validating packaging data. But for our existing customers and anyone else that's interested, when we circulate and publish the webinar for today, you can find some more information about our regulation readiness course that will launch in September this year. That would be very basic, it'll be online and easy to access. So that's quite exciting from our end. I'll shut up because it's time to talk to Chris. As I said at the start, yeah, I'm very excited for today's conversation. Chris, as Francesca outlined, is the Vice President of Public Affairs at TOMRA. I'm sure everyone's well aware of who TOMRA is and what TOMRA does in the market, but let me just firstly say thanks for coming, Chris, and start with a very simple question around your view from the outside. And sort of thinking about this, TOMRA is a very significant global business. You operate in close to 40 or maybe more than 40 deposit return markets globally.
That's actually up to 60 now. So there's 60 with another 15 CDS markets going live in the next 2 years. So quite significant. Yeah.
That's incredible. I don't know how you wrap your head around regulations in up to 60 markets, but that's a large data pool of information to have. So talk to me about that then. From your vantage point, how does Australia's reform trajectory look? So, and are we on a familiar path to what you've seen in other markets that have made the transition into CDSs and EPRs?
It's a good question because Australia recently celebrated with the launch of Tasmania as a CDS market. We're the first continent in the world to have container deposit schemes. There are a lot of container deposit schemes all around the world, but some have them in Europe, some don't. Same in America, same in Canada. But we have a CDS across the board in Australia. But they are separate schemes, and they are designed very differently to many schemes. I would say our reform has been fantastic. The commitment from Australian governments to recognise that CDS is a form of EPR that works. It's very much the low-hanging fruit of EPR because it's been tried and tested overseas. But I would also still say that there's a lot of work to go in Australia with container deposit schemes because from the outset, and this is where design is incredibly important, our schemes, though they have increased recycling rates of beverage containers quite significantly, not to the level that we've seen in some of the best performing schemes in Europe. For example, across the board in Australia, we see return rates in about the mid-60s, some higher, some lower, but that is considered quite a low return rate through container deposit schemes compared to some of these European markets that see return rates. Like Finland, 99% of all containers sold onto the market are returned through the network. Germany's 98%. Somewhere like Lithuania, within 2 years, had a return rate going from about 30% to 92% in only 2 years. So as you can see there, due to design choices, there's probably a bit more reform that can be done in the Australian CDS as a form of EPR to get up to those high levels of circular outcomes that you see in other markets.
So you mentioned design choices. In your sort of, within your world, what separate success from failure, design choices that most reliably separate high-performing systems from underperforming ones or emerging systems.
Yeah, look, this is probably where design at an outset is really important. Australian scheme, well, for those who aren't aware, the first container deposit scheme, one of the first in the world, was in South Australia in 1977, and it was designed around the market at the time. Recycling wasn't almost really even a thing at that point in time. It was more a litter reduction initiative. But as a result of that, a lot of other schemes around Australia has followed the model of South Australia. Whereas in the rest of the world, they've followed their own model. And the design choices taken in Europe that are different to Australia is two things, which is the two key success factors being a financial incentive to return and convenience. And you would see in these European markets that have those very high return rates, you see a much higher financial incentive for consumers to return. In Germany, you've got 42-cent equivalent deposit value on all containers, as opposed to the 10 cents that we have in Australia. Importantly, it was about 35-cent equivalent in 1977 when South Australia, but we just haven't put up our deposit in line with inflation in that time, whereas European markets have. So that is the first design choice that has seen very, very high return rates. And then the other design choice is that convenience for consumers to return. So therefore, for example, in Australia, we have, for example, again in South Australia, in metropolitan Adelaide, I think it's one return point for every 34,000 citizens. In Finland and Germany, you're looking at one return point for every 600 citizens. So the ability for people to return is much higher. So they're the two real key things that I would say that Australia still has to work on to get our return rates up to a level that we see in other markets. And these are things that really need to be considered when we are looking at EPR, is design at the outset, because it is very, very hard to change a design once it has been implemented.
So on those numbers then, would you be a proponent of increasing the fees for collection? And I know that's a little bit contentious in the space, but would a higher return rate fee be a driver of better recycling rates?
Probably not. Look, I probably wouldn't say that in a container deposit scheme market. It really is the incentive for the consumer to return. So if you're talking about a fee at AKA, if we're looking at it through the lens of a deposit, if there was a higher deposit, then yes, there is no doubt international evidence suggests that there would be higher return rates. And we saw that in South Australia when they put up their deposit value from 5 cents to 10 cents. Deposit values, I think it was an instant 15% increase in the amount of returns coming through that network. But that just hasn't happened since for many, many years now. So, yeah. But it's I can understand the politics around that. There are some significant political concerns, particularly in cost of living crisis, as everyone talks about that. Unless you put a high deposit value in at the outset, it's very hard to kind of move it later on down the track.
Yeah. So let's talk about collection and sorting. There is a tendency to treat EPRs as a sort of regulation question.
Yep.
But our webinar description and the purpose of today is to make the point that effective reform depends on better collection, sorting, and recycling systems. From your perspective and broadly more from TOMRA's perspective, where do infrastructure gaps most often undermine good policy, and where do you believe Australia should be investing first?
It's heard a really good point the other day that says policy doesn't collect a single bit of packaging, infrastructure does. So I think the infrastructure piece is incredibly important. Again, looking at it through the lens of CDS, if you put in place a policy that says every container placed on the market has to have a deposit attached to it that consumers can redeem, but you don't have the infrastructure to collect it, then the whole system falls over. So absolutely, infrastructure is important. I would say that Australia has pretty good collection. We have curbside in every council, or pretty much every council. Consumers know what to do. There probably is, with an incoming EPR scheme, there is probably still a fair bit of work to do in terms of infrastructure. Under a modern EPR scheme for packaging, there will be requirements for high levels of sorting into multiple different fractions, 12, 15 different fractions. We do have modern MRFs, but probably not all. Some investment probably needs to be put into the sorting capacity of some of these smaller MRFs and MRFs that haven't invested. But hopefully that's what an EPR does. An EPR supports that investment in the long term, but you kind of need to have the infrastructure in place before the EPR goes live. One of the things we've seen in Europe happening is a lot of investment in what's called mixed waste sorting, which is extracting the material out of the residual waste. There's still a lot of material that is ending up in landfill because source separation with consumers, people are generally pretty good. They tend to put their recycling into the yellow lid bin, as we call it in Victoria, but there's still a lot going in the red lid bin and other places. Having EPR fees potentially going towards supporting recycling facilities to put in place mechanisms to sort what's in that red bin and extract that 25 to 35% of material that is still going to landfill. And that's what we've seen in Europe, is a lot of MRFs and even countries saying we need to find ways in which to increase our recycling rates through increased sorting capacity that we're not currently getting at the moment due to bad source separation.
I'm going to cut to the heart of, I guess, a 125-year-old challenge for our nation, and that's the federated state-by-state sort of approach, and ask you a question of how important sort of harmonisation, national harmonisation is versus fragmentation. You've seen in other markets, but when you talk about sort of the recycling rates across, Scandinavia, Germany, Lithuania, I assume they're all national, not state by state. How important is a national framework and a national system versus independent states going it alone?
Yeah, and that's what we've seen in CDS. There was talk when it was only South Australia and Northern Territory that had a container deposit scheme. There was serious discussions around how do we have a harmonised CDS. For whatever reason, that fell through, and I think certain states just decided to go on their own, and that's why we have a fragmented container deposit scheme markets. And it has, though our schemes work very, very well independently, it has caused issues still for particularly small and new entrants into the market, because there is different scopes. Western Australia has only just recently brought wine and spirits into their scheme. South Australia has announced it. New South Wales has announced it. ACT's announced it, but Victoria and Tasmania still haven't announced that they're going to be bringing these new. So, I've got friends who are in the wine industry in Victoria who are completely unaware that Western Australia has a deposit on wine bottles. Because they're just looking at every other state. So there's just that bit of confusion. It's caused duplicated compliance efforts, different network setups, different registration processes. So there are significant issues, I imagine, for brand owners with having a fragmented system. So it really, looking at when the federal government is looking at designing a mandatory EPR for packaging, I think looking at CDS, looking at what it has done, what's worked well, but particularly that harmonisation piece is very, very important, because another fragmented state-by-state system, there's talk of that potentially happening. New South Wales has said, well, if the federal government doesn't do it, we'll do it alone. So we can already see discussions progressing that way. But I think looking at CDS as a non-harmonised system is, I guess, a bit of a warning sign, I guess you could say, for the federal government in terms of that EPR piece.
Yeah, and perfect segue, because a number of people on this call would be heavily invested and interested in CDS, but it doesn't serve the whole market. It's specific for those that are placing certain types of products on market. So let's move more broadly to EPR. Most people are interested in direction of travel. I sort of made it quite clear that Europe and EU are the right places to look for where our policy makers will take leadership and insight from. UK launched its EPR in April 2025. I mentioned the PPWR coming into effect in the EU in August 2026. From your perspective, what should brands be surprised about in these markets? What should they be looking for? What type of insight should they take? And what should they be doing right now in preparation for an EPR?
Yeah, it's a tricky question for us to answer, because we're not a brand owner. But I've sought some advice from some of my colleagues in Europe who have seen this firsthand. And the one thing that I've heard is that the fees have come faster than brands have expected, not because they didn't see it coming, but it was just not something that was planned for. You're doing everyday business. This is just a compliance issue. But then the invoices start coming, particularly in the UK, the invoices start coming. You're like, oh my God, we haven't thought about this. And another quote I heard was that, CFOs have gone from ignoring packaging to owning packaging in about 6 months. So that, whereas, the finance department is like, the packaging is just separate to what we're doing. Now they're looking at that and going, well, we're paying all these fees, but there's margins we don't have to pay if the packaging had been redesigned earlier, if we had got onto this earlier. We don't even know what packaging we put on the market. We don't have great data. So that has been a really important learning, I think, for a lot of businesses when packaging EPR does come in. And the other thing that's been really interesting from what I've heard is that retailers have become market enforcers very, very quickly. Brands that have not redesigned their packaging, or they're still operating under the status quo, are not necessarily being fined. The fine isn't so much of an issue. It's potentially being delisted. eBay, Temu, Amazon, even the large retailers, they have their own ESG targets, and they're looking at brands and going, well, are you aligned to the direction of EPR? So they're really the main things that we're seeing, and also hearing that internal data of brands is lacking. A lot of brands don't even know the packaging that they're putting on the market, what it's composed of, how would it be redesigned, how hard would it be to be redesigned. So these are certainly the things that I think brand owners in Australia can look at. And it shifts the question not from, is packaging EPR going to happen in Australia or not? I think brands would need to say, again, I'm not a brand owner, so take this with a pinch of salt, but look at it through the lens of packaging EPR with eco-modulation will happen. And it'll probably happen quicker than what most brands are anticipating. So start that work now. The brands that have started the work early in Europe are the ones that are succeeding under the current environment. I think we in the last webinar that you did with Simon Dowding from Pact, you said there's a high likelihood that Australia will look to the UK. Obviously, the PPWR exists, but the UK's EPR scheme is one that Australia may model it on. Looking at that, looking at the eco-modulation fees associated with that. For those who aren't aware, they do a traffic light system: red, amber, and green. Amber is the base. It's technically recyclable. And then if it's green, which is totally recyclable, it's a 9% discount. And then if it is not recyclable at all, the packaging is given a red light, which goes all the way up to ×2 by 28, 29. So there's pretty significant fees associated. And packaging takes a long time to redesign, so I'm told. So getting on the front foot now.
Yeah, a great summarization. I think not being a brand owner gave you more objectivity and strength in that response, Chris. So thanks for that. I can certainly validate how many times we've heard from brand owners, sustainability leaders, procurement leaders, how they need to develop a business case to take to the finance team, to take to the CFO. And you're right around that switch. We all care deeply about the product, but having awareness, visibility, knowledge around the packaging, what it's made from, where it's come from, how much it costs, does matter. And in a world we're moving into with compliance, I'll leave the packaging data stuff. Ed's going to speak on that momentarily, and I did want to ask a question around how quickly that we should start be thinking about fees. But you've answered that really well. I'll just push on to a question about reuse. Often reuse is sort of seen as the next frontier before recycling, which I think is a little bit unfair. If you think about a waste hierarchy, you've got reduce, reuse, and then down to recover. So it's all connected as opposed to a new frontier. But what are you seeing internationally with the movement around reuse? PPWR talks about the need to reuse things in recycling systems, and there's incentives to do so. How realistic do you see reuse as being a part of the emerging EPR framework?
Yeah, how realistic is a tough question to answer. I would like to be able to say, look, I see it as being highly realistic. A bit of a frustration from where TOMRA sits is that whenever we talk about packaging EPR, it's very much about recycling. It isn't, reuse doesn't really come into it, but that is obviously much higher up the waste hierarchy. And reuse is achievable. I think there's a lot of excuses for not implementing reuse, and so what you're seeing is individual cities, individual states going alone. Uh, from where TOMRA sits, we see that there was a real missed opportunity with the PPWR around reuse. There was pretty significant mandatory targets in the original drafting of the PPWR. Mandatory targets of takeaway packaging saying 10% reusable by 2030, rising to 40% by 2040. I mean, that's some pretty, significant targets. That's now been watered down to the terminology endeavour to offer 10% of products in packaging formats suitable for reuse by 2030. So as you can see, there has been a marked shift away from reuse as part of PPWR. TOMRA is very involved in reuse. We run reuse systems and support different cities around the world with implementing reuse systems. So we see the Australian EPR reform process integrating some form of mandatory reuse targets into that as something that where Australia can go much further than what we're seeing in Europe. So yeah, look, it's a tricky one to answer because I can't say. The question was how realistic. I don't know. There's a lot of advocacy going around at the moment around reuse, and governments are very interested. I took heart with a recent discussion paper put out by the ACT government talking about how we implement reuse systems. It wasn't just about banning certain problematic packaging types. It was talking about, well, rather than banning it, how do we shift towards different reusable types under a reuse system? That was great, but at this stage, I can't see too much talk in the federal government about integrating reuse into it. We've certainly advocated for it, but the proof will be in the pudding when we see the design.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people on this call too who have presented a similar case to Minister Watt's office. So as you've clearly said, that's not your role. I'm going to ask another subjective question because we're coming close to the end of our time with you, Chris. It is about confidence and timing. You've talked about the investment in recycling infrastructure and the requirements that has to drive policy certainty. You've sort of worked at this intersection of public policy and the private sector, which gives you quite a unique advantage to most of us lay people who haven't worn those two hats. If you were advising a brand owner today, knowing that you're not a brand owner, how much confidence would you place in the current trajectory? And if there's any risk in waiting for the final detail? You kind of mentioned to get ready, but give us your view of the world about whether EPR will come in the next few months or
not. In the next few months, look, who knows in politics? Political cycles don't operate the same as business cycles do. If the political imperative is there to get it done, then it'll get done. My view is I reckon it's going to happen much quicker than we think. There is a global trend towards packaging EPR. It's well supported. Even New Zealand's talking about mandatory EPR for plastic packaging. It's something we don't hear about much in Australia, and it may even happen before Australia, the way that they're talking. But so I feel pretty confident that that mandatory EPR will happen. Whether or not it's in the next few months or not, I couldn't say. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but hopefully it would. But because of that, and sorry, stepping back a little bit, I think you can probably use again CDS as a good example. Is that Victoria is a good example in CDS. There was just no momentum towards CDS in Victoria at all. And then it only took one political decision, good advocacy internally by a certain minister.
Yep.
And then it was established very, very quickly. I think we could probably see a similar thing happen with packaging EPR. So if I was advising brands around that, I would start operating as if it will happen quickly. You know, bringing your finance teams together, bringing your marketing teams, your sustainability team, your sales teams together, collectively looking at what packaging you're putting on market at the moment, preparing for a scheme in 2 years. Looking at the UK EPR scheme, looking at the fees and the eco-modulation associated with that, doing your numbers, seeing what it will cost, seeing what the savings would be if you redesign the packaging now. They're the kind of things that I'd probably be advising brands to be doing in the short term.
Yeah, that's great. I did have a question on the future of technology in this space, but I might provide that as a Dorothy Dixer for the Q&A segment that's to follow, because I'm going to hand off to Ed. I'll just pull the slides back up. We've got to the segment to share a bit more detail around, is that sharing? Should be. Okay. I'm hoping that is sharing. Chris, that was a perfect sort of framework around the necessity to be prepared, irrespective of decisions that are made out of our hands. Everyone on this call has the opportunity to respond, prepare, and be ready for what's forthcoming, whether it's a few months or next year, when a formal announcement will land and when fees will sort of follow. So that brings us to the end of that sort of practical discussion. And if it tells us anything, it's that businesses should be ready. I want to handball to Ed and bring Ed in this conversation. As Francesca said, Ed's our resident expert for all things packaging, design, optimization, and even EPR, which he'll laugh about. But Ed's going to do a quick illustration about the need to be ready for an EPR scheme. So I'll go on mute and let Ed join the.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. Awesome. Just quickly responding to a couple of things, Chris. By the way, Chris, you've kind of done my job for me. Thank you very much. You've outlined most of the things that our awesome customers need to do and potential customers. Just responding quickly. That reuse thing inside the PPWR thing will happen naturally as well, because costs associated with packaging will drive system change. I think that's one quick thing I wanted to observe. I think Europe are in a different investment cycle. They're much further ahead than we are already, and I think that refinement to move them, say, 65% to 85% is a different refinement. So they're talking about red bins, right? But we're not even there yet in terms of our journey, and I think that's important we call that out. And then the last thing for me was kind of, if you kind of listen to the core narrative, Australian Recycling Association and the like, there's a bit of an underutilization of our infrastructure potentially. And if regulation doesn't come, then there's a high risk that we kind of lose some of that. So I think that's kind of, and that's a very high level kind of observation, and there's much more detail to it, and it's more nuanced than that, I understand. But that's the general vibe that I've been listening to over the last sort of 12 months. I mean, we need to do something quickly. So I'm just going to quickly talk about UK, EU, and US. That's a lot of letters on that page for me. I struggle with letters generally. And I'm going to speak to that in terms of EPR, PPWR, digital product passports. I kind of very focused on product as well. It's something else that's becoming more and more evident for our customers. Obviously, APCO, and what all of those things mean is data. They all require data to deliver an outcome. So we've touched on it already. So there's circa 85 countries in the world either have or are moving towards EPR, including Australia. UK was 1.4 billion in fees in 2025. I think that makes people anxious when we talk about that in Australia, but I think we're in a slightly different trajectory in terms of how we implement fees. That was evident from the Senate hearing that Ellie and I sat at and listened to. It's a softer runway to fees, taking on board your comments around cost of living. And incidentally, 1.56 billion in 2026 forecast for the UK. US, 7 states, more states coming online. So we're lucky enough to have customers in UK and US. So we kind of understand a little bit of what's going on there, and I'll come on to that. And then obviously 27 states across the EU. We've touched on this 12th of August being a kickoff, and that ramping towards 2030. Quickly on fees and eco-modulation. So I just want to define fee equals material and the amount of mass. So a ton is a price. Eco-modulation is the discount. How do I achieve a discount on my fee? That's the discount framework. It's important that we kind of get that narrative right. And that's my simple way of putting that. And when compliance becomes cost driven, it's a very different lever. So it was kind of interesting to hear you talk about the CFOs running towards the invoices that they're receiving. It now gets a different kind of attention in the business, which sort of speaks to the fact that voluntary doesn't work and so on and so forth. And the other one is not just cost, it's risk. So reputational risk is another biggie. I think that sort of sits in that. And for big brand owners, that's really important. So I'm just going to I'm going to whistle top through UK, EU, US very, very quickly. And I picked three things that we're talking to our customers about in each of those markets or in preparation for. So we've touched on the UK. 1st of September, you kind of need your data locked down because that's going to be what you're invoiced against. You mentioned the surprise. So one of the things that we've been talking to businesses about is budget. So we support, therefore, the modeling of EPR fees and things like that. Of course we do, and that's what technology is really good at. It's straightforward, it's inputs, outputs. And then, of course, at the moment, if you look at the US, for example, it's high-level data. PPWR is much more granular, much more evidence. UK we're at component level data. We're kind of now starting to get into that component level data, which is the direction of travel. And Elliot already mentioned sort of audit quality and evidence to support that data inside of your business. I think Chris touched on it a little bit. Downside. So I wanted to look at downsides of not doing this work because I think that's important. Admin breaches in the UK, apparently civil actions is 5% of projected turnover, right? So that's not an insignificant number for non-compliance. Naming, and this is a common theme throughout, public naming of companies that don't comply. And I think that's a high risk, for reputational risk for businesses. And just so we're clear, plastic tax, and Chris might be able to help me with this as well, is separate, right, from EPR. It's an additional tax in the UK. It's not instead of. So there's a lot of things going on in the UK, but they all come back to being prepared and having that information and data. So, and that's for the compliance, and then it becomes like a risk thing. But then it's about actually how do we optimize, how do we change, and how do we improve? And that's that simplification of packaging materials, the addition of recycled content. That's the eco-modulation narrative. And you can't really change anything until you kind of know what you've got. And that's the journey that we're on with most of our customers. EU, you've kind of covered EU quite quickly. So 12th of August, we know that's kind of a hard line. Declaration of conformity is you basically signing away. The lawyer will say, don't sign it. Definitely sign it because you need it. But it's you're that actually declaring what you're saying is right. And that's kind of smart from the EU because they're holding people to account. And that's an interesting way to do it. And the customer needs to be registered. So if you're trading in different states, don't assume that that's like a seamless system. It's not. You need to register in the different states that you're trading into as part of the EU framework. We've already mentioned PSTAT. There's no PFAS and similar type chemicals. It's a hard stop. There's no rollout. You kind of have to have got rid of that stuff. They've been on notice of that for a while. And then kind of the guidance is something, again, Chris alluded to, is MAP, right? So PPWR is a journey to 2030. You kind of have to map what it is that you need to do when. And it gets quite granular as you move down through that process, like recyclability grades and all sorts of different bits of information that you're going to need. And I think it comes back to design thinking. Chris mentioned it a few times. Really start thinking about what you're doing before you do it. Really hard to do that retrospective. Anything that exists, not possible. So we have to start design thinking and system change, which is where I think that reuse comes in. And then downside in the EU is not dissimilar, right? Obligation for states to impose penalties by February 27 is a thing that's happening. So they're all on it. Enforcement is private, and Chris mentioned this as well. So if you sell something through Amazon are going to now be responsible. Many other fulfillment providers available are going to be responsible for making sure that you're compliant. So that's private compliance to all intents and purposes to support the government push out. and ultimately market access. And we talk about this, and we've talked about this in different webinars. This will all come down US, UK, EU is market access. If you don't do it, you'll lose market access. And Chris said the same thing. I'm going quickly because Chris said these things, so it's kind of, I'm whizzing through this. And then quickly on US, a little bit of a softer start. Kind of they've already pushed back a few things, a few months there. Fees are more progressive. Oregon started, California will start this year. Fees are coming in slowly. Build SKU level data, so the higher level data, but then moving towards granularity. And watch for changes, state by state regulations, and they're all kind of moving their thresholds in the states. I think that's a problem, right? That's a patchwork of sort of pain points for brand owners. And I think that's a beware Australia kind of narrative as well. If we kind of go down that route, everyone's got them setting their own different rules. And of course, it's America, so they're already seeing some lawsuits and things like that coming into play. But we're also seeing some consolidated reporting happening there as well. So there's a bit of consolidation of data that in order how you report that into different entities. So, and the last bit for me, I made a little note on a section called the vibe or mood in the different countries, and Chris might be able to pick up on this at the end. I think an interesting observation, maybe in questions we get to it, glass in the UK is kind of feels very aggrieved. I read somewhere it was like 5% of waste, but 30% of fees. You know, glasses are heavy, so it's kind of maybe a slightly ill-conceived metric. We need to change that, and maybe Chris will have an opinion on that as well in terms of recovery of that, and potentially through their types of systems. So I think that's kind of important to understand. And most of the incentives are aligned to good design. That would be a high-level observation. So broadly, that's kind of the general. Do good things and good things will happen. That doesn't mean fees will be removed, but they'll be managed and reduced, and your risk will be managed. In the EU, there's a lot of policy, was another one, and it's coming fast and people aren't quite ready. That would be an observation as well. And then 2 points to finish. And I wanted to try and finish on something positive, because I think broadly this is a positive story if we get it right. I think a lot of things happen before regulation starts, in anticipation of regulation, and they never get measured, right? And we see that in Australia, we see it in Europe, US, right? They're already starting to change things at the thought of regulation. We never get to measure that, but I think it's significant. And then the last thing for me was real investment. I did some quick calcs based on some reading. I reckon UK, USA, Europe, there's about 70 billion US being invested in those countries, just those three, and bearing in mind there's maybe 80 countries around the world with EPR, to support infrastructure, to support different outcomes. So this isn't all about taking polluter pays, right? There's a lot of this going back in, and a good EPR will also deliver some value on the other side. So that's kind of me. I'll leave it at that. I'm conscious of time and some questions.
Thanks for that, Ed. And thanks as well to Chris and Elliot. Yeah, if we've got a little bit of time left to hop into a Q&A. So if there were any questions that came up for you during that discussion, just put them in the chat now. And we'll hand over to the speakers to answer.
Can I ask a quick question of Chris?
Oh.
Hey, Chris.
Yep.
Can you just pick up on that narrative in the UK around glass, and in terms of kind of what your systems may or may not offer? I'm guessing of the 60 countries that you're in, that's one of them. What does that look like for you?
Well, in terms of a container deposit scheme, we support the integration of glass into, as part of scope. Glass is part of the scope of all Australian schemes. You don't see as much of it in Europe. Interestingly, in the UK, and this is new information, so don't necessarily quote me on it, but I did hear that the history of this is there was a fair bit of advocacy done by the glass packaging beverage industry in the UK to keep glass out of the container deposit scheme that's going live at the end of next year. But then what's happened is that the fees for the container deposit scheme have come out, and that we also now know the fees for the EPR in the UK. And as it turns out, the fees associated with the EPR are actually higher than the fees that they would be paying if it was in the CDS. This is just sort of information that I've heard from someone, but it's an interesting one, the glass one, whereby I think a lot of the glass industry now is going, oh, I wish we were actually in the container deposit scheme than we were in the EPR, because there's lower fees associated with it, because the efficiencies you get with a glass in container deposit scheme are better than the efficiency you get with glass being part of the EPR. So that's probably a bit of an insight that I have on the glass debate.
There's a question here around brands selling into both Australia and Europe, and how much of the work that they're doing to prepare for PPWR can be reused for future Australian EPR requirements. I think that's a really interesting one, given what you were talking about earlier, Chris, with state level harmonisation, but also the fact that a lot of companies that will be selling into different global markets with different EPR have to encompass all of those requirements. Are there certain things that you're seeing pop up from a CDS perspective, but also, Ed, maybe things from a brand perspective that will encompass both of those? Should they just follow the highest standard? Is that the easiest way to operate?
I can help you if you want, Chris.
Sorry, I thought that was directed at Ed. My apologies.
The first part was you. The second part was Ed. I'll jump in. It's a really good question, and a hard one to answer when it's not completely known. If you're taking a framework of where Australia sits today with a voluntary system run through a co-regulator at APCO, and comparing that to PPWR, the obvious part is collecting and structuring packaging data matters. So it doesn't matter on the outcome. The formats will change. Technology can help with that. We're one of many groups that can help with that. But actually collecting that hard to find packaging and product data across your supply chain, structuring it, validating it, making sure it's accurate and updated, etc. The outcome's easy. That's the easy bit. You can push an outcome based on building the right packaging data asset. So irrespective of market. And so Australia's a hard place to answer. Having been in London recently, a lot of questions coming up about PPWR from UK brands, what they've got to do in the UK, how different is that to PPWR? And there is a lot of work going around harmonisation and making sure that data flow is consistent and not arduous and not unfair. So I think, Chris's point was great, being ready, collecting, structuring, managing that packaging data, because the format will change per jurisdiction, but there will be ability to repurpose across different jurisdictions. Chris, if there's anything you want to add with CDS, but I hope that helps with the EPR side.
No, look, I think that's, you pretty much cover it off. As EPR schemes and CDS become more embedded throughout the world. I mean, because a lot of the organisations, a lot of people in the room won't just operate just in Australia, will be operating globally. So if you're redesigning your package for one market, but that the policy situation is going to change in all markets eventually, well, why not just do the work now, and then that implementation phase, I guess you could say, with any new EPR scheme, whether it be CDS or packaging EPR, is much easier. Why wait to do it when you know it's coming and you're already doing it anyway in a certain market?
I'll quickly just jump in 2 points. Pretty sure I was meant to plug Phantm's technology further to my state of affairs around the world. But I think this is a nice segue to that quickly. That first mile data collection, is critically important, and Phantm have developed a very good technology to support that. And the way that we do that is we go as close to the suppliers or to the suppliers as possible, and we've kind of come up with a good way to do that, because the truth is brand owners don't own that information or understand it necessarily, and that's very much to do with knowledge, and there's lots of good work being done in that space, but we can support that. And then the aggregation of data. So what's the best? We were talking about this the other day internally, like the algorithm of where's the mean, right? If I'm trading in more than one country, regulation, material, what is the mean that you need to find to operate in more than one market? So yeah, and that's technology can help with all that. Having the data enables us to kind of help you make those decisions, because all of our data is kind of aligned to regulation, it's aligned to the policies, it's aligned to the the suppliers, and this is kind of where we do. This is where we play. That's our whole point of our existence, if you like. So yeah.
I know we have only a minute to go, but there's a really great question that's popped up from Toby. Do you think that states should be supporting EPR by continuing with the phase out of problematic plastics and promoting reuse in settings such as stadiums or events?
Look, I'm happy to take that one, and I think absolutely, it's reuse is higher up the hierarchy. If things can be phased out and phased out easily, why not? I think one of the concerns government has had is yes, but if we phase it out, what replaces it? And not looking at reuse through the frame of a reuse system. I use that example of you would never set up a CDS without having the infrastructure to follow. Reuse, collection, sorting, washing, redistribution infrastructure does exist. It is being used around the world. The phasing out of single-use plastics particularly, and I'll even talk about coffee cups, can be done and replaced with a reuse, collection and sorting redistribution system quite easily. But it just takes that political will. So I don't think, I don't think the EPR discussion, the packaging EPR discussion should stop that progression towards reuse at all. The more reuse that we have and the more phasing out of problematic items, the better in my mind.
I knew you're the right person for that answer, Chris.
So I saw that and just jumped straight in. It sort of aligns to what we're doing globally. I could talk about this a lot more, but I think we've run out of time. So if anyone can reach out if they want more information.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, like Chris said, if anyone does have any further questions, just get in touch and we'll happily answer them. But thank you all so much for joining today. As Elliot mentioned before, there might be a bit more information coming out on the Regulation Ready course, so keep your eyes out for that. And we have another webinar down the track planned as well. But thanks again for joining and have a lovely Wednesday, everyone.